Welcome to this workshop for under the International Civil Society Centre's Scanning the Horizon community. We have been looking at online tools over the past few months that can really be used for more collaborative and inclusive ways of thinking about the future and having conversations across organisations and also asynchronously around the world. And one of these tools is we're going to present today. So the objectives of this session today is to increase your familiarization with the PAR-EVO tool for both scenarios and evaluation. We will hear in detail from two use cases. So one on alternative future scenarios, which will be from ODI, and one about alternative paths more for strategic evaluation. There will be time for you to have Q&A and interaction with the practitioners, and we'd also like to spend some time at the end exploring ideas for other applications, but also your thoughts on how you think you might use it with more of the information that you've had available through the workshop. So after this, we will have an overview from Rick Davis, who is the developer of the tool. So he's going to talk through us about what makes PAR-EVO unique from other scenario tools and how it's been used so far by different organisations. Then we will have Louise from ODI who will talk about this futures use case, and there'll be time for Q&A with Louise as well. Then we'll have a short break because that's already quite a lot of input. And then we'll hear from Eva, who's been working using PAR-EVO for a strategic evaluation on behalf of UN volunteers. And then we'll move into much more interactive session where we will hear a shorter input from Nama, who's also used it in a different format. And then we would like to hear your ideas based on what you've heard. And then we'll close with how you can stay engaged with both communities and also with PAR-EVO. I'd like to invite Rick. So a quick background to Rick. Rick is a highly experienced independent monitoring and evaluation consultant who has extensive experience evaluating development programs for NGOs bilaterally and multilaterals. And Rick is also a keen developer of new evaluation tools, such as PAR-EVO, and making these available to wider practitioners. Would you like to share your screen, Rick?
Yes. Can we have some feedback from the Slido results, just so I can get an idea of where people are at before I proceed? Do people know about scenario planning? Most people have ticked 2, which is just a little bit, basically. Am I reading that correctly, Vicky?
Yes.
Okay, so let's have a look at the second question. How much do you now know about PAR-EVO? I'm pleased to see that very few have clicked on nothing, because we did ask everybody to have a look at the video before today. If anybody would like to confess as to not seeing the video, we will sell you an indulgence for that. And the last question is, how much are you interested in using PAR-EVO? Well, I'm really pleased to see the high level of response there. So basically, I'm going to be talking about a few aspects of PAR-EVO on the assumption that most of you, in fact, almost all of you, have viewed the video of the UK Evaluation Society webinar, which introduced how PAR-EVO worked. But this slide is just basically summarizing the definition of PAR-EVO, which is an open source method and an online web application for developing alternative past histories or future scenarios using a participatory process based on a simple notion of how evolution works. And the graphic on the left-hand side is basically the logo for the tool, but it represents this notion of a seed growing into different directions, with branches growing in different directions, and each of these is a storyline going in different directions, some of which are dying out and some of which are proliferating and continue into the present and in the future. So that's where we're starting off. And I was asked to pose and answer the question of how PAR-EVO compares to other scenario planning approaches. I suppose the first thing to say here is there is a huge variety of approaches to doing scenario planning, which vary on multiple dimensions, and I'll cover some of these. But basically, these 4 points here, 5 points here, highlight what I think are some of the key differences here. And later on, any of you who have got more familiarity with scenario planning than me, please speak up and let me know of other differences that you can see. So I suppose the first difference is that PowerEvo generates more scenarios, that is a greater number of scenarios than many scenario planning approaches, many of which end up generating, not all of which, but probably the most familiar format people have seen is a 2x2 matrix of two different characteristics, types of characteristics of futures. And when you combine these, you get 4 possibilities. This is by far the most common representation of or combination of scenario planning futures that you might see, but there are a lot of other versions as well. But I think in terms of numbers of scenarios that are generated, PowerEvo is significantly different in that respect. The second is that with a lot of scenario planning exercises, a lot of preparatory work goes into scanning the horizon, looking for the latest information, looking for trends, looking for data, getting expert views, and then out of that, developing a number of narratives about what can happen in the future. Whereas PowerEvo is almost the opposite way around. It starts off developing narratives, storylines, multiple storylines about what could happen in the future. And then after that is done, there is an evaluation process built in at the end of the exercise where the participants and others can evaluate those storylines on multiple dimensions. But also there is the possibility of doing more analysis of those storylines, and which I will touch upon in the next few points. The third difference is that unlike many participatory processes, which are in most cases face-to-face, PowerEvo is participatory, but people's participation is anonymous. That is, when people make contributions to the storylines, the identity of who contributed what to the storylines is not visible to those participants. It is visible to the facilitator who's orchestrating the exercise, but not to the participants themselves. And this is quite significant because it separates out ideas from the owners and carriers of ideas. And in organizations, often those two things get mixed together, and the politics of organizations ends up influencing how ideas are picked up and not picked up. The third point I want to make here is that PowerEvo takes a participatory approach to evaluation of the storylines. The storyline contributors themselves are the first participants, but others can be engaged in this process as well. And that process of participatory evaluation of the storylines involves both open-ended questions and closed-ended questions. So we have some prior notions of what we think we want to ask people about the different futures, but we're also trying to be open to different ways of seeing the differences between the storylines, and that's why we use the open-ended questions as well. Finally, when it comes to analyzing the results of a PowerEvo exercise, there are two aspects of an exercise that we can analyze. One is the products, which are the storylines. What are the themes emerging in these storylines? How realistic are they? How likely are they? How desirable are they? But the other is that we can analyze the process, whose contributions built on whose, what types of patterns of cooperation do we find in the process of building these scenarios, and what significance does that have for what we're seeing and what could be developed in the future. I'll just finish off on this topic with this diagram here, which I've taken from a recent paper by Bengtson, which looks at the use of scenario planning in the area of natural resources. And it's a nice three-dimensional sort of differentiation between scenario planning approaches. On one dimension, there's qualitative versus quantitative. On another is imagination versus evidence. And on another is participatory versus expert. And you can probably guess from what I've said already that PowerEvo, at first glance, is more towards the qualitative than the quantitative, more towards the imaginative than the evidence-based, and more towards the participatory than the expert-based. But in practice, when you look at things, in the analysis, there can be a lot of quantitative analysis of the content of storylines. And likewise, the storyline content, although generated by people's imagination, will be influenced by available evidence, and evidence can be brought in through various channels which we can discuss to prompt people's imagination, to ground it and connect it. And we can also find different roles for expert opinion in a participatory process. I'll just try and move on to the next slide. I've also been asked to describe some attributes of the recent Parivo exercises. I think we've carried out about 11 exercises so far. Many of these initially were members of communities of practice, monitoring and evaluation communities of practice, who volunteered their time to be guinea pigs in the process. We've also had UNV volunteers, and we're going to hear something about that. We've had members of an organisation. We're going to hear something about that. And most recently, I've been crowdsourcing research subjects from a website called prolific.co. And in this case, they were crowdsourced from the UK. The average number of participants has been from between 10 and 15 participants. The average number of iterations or generations in the process of developing the storylines has been around 7 to 8, covering a time period anywhere from 2 years to about 5 years. And when we implement this process, because we've got people participating from all around the world, we usually allow between 2 and 3 days per iteration, because people are in different time zones. But the actual time that people spend in reading the content and then writing their own contributions, in my experience, and this may vary when we hear from the other presenters, is about 30 minutes per person per iteration. The topics that we've covered have ranged quite a lot. We've had a number on climate change, and I've got one going on that at the moment. We've had one on post-Brexit Britain, one on COVID and beyond, one on strategic planning, and we'll be hearing about that. Another one on the future of the United States after the election of President Biden. Another one on the careers of UN volunteers. And we'll be hearing from Nama about Kenyan farmers and their experience with field trials. And also, I've got one going on at the moment about COP26 and beyond. Most of these are about the future, but there have been 2 which have been looking at the past, and we'll be hearing about those today. How am I going for time there, Vicky? Am I a bit behind time or not?
Yeah, you're a little behind time.
Okay, so just for those who did have a look at the video but need reminding, this is what the interface of the Parivo website looks like. At the top left is an image which sort of symbolizes the content of the exercise. In this case, it was about the future of the United States and by definition, almost the rest of the world. And then underneath the title, Alternative Futures for the USA, is text which is written by the facilitator giving guidance to the participants. And that text is updated with each new iteration. Underneath that, we have 2 things. We have a body of text on the right-hand side, which is one storyline. And you can see this is partitioned into paragraphs of different colors. So each of these paragraphs is written in a subsequent iteration. So at the moment, you can see one storyline here with 5 contributions written over 5 iterations. And on the left-hand side, you can see a fairly dense tree structure. And that is basically showing you the whole set of storylines and how they relate to each other. And one way of navigating around this is you click on different nodes at the bottom of this tree structure, and that'll move you between the different storylines. Or you can click on these chevrons at the top, and that'll move you into storylines with the adjacent numbers. Each paragraph contribution has got a number, and each storyline, as it's proceeded down to this generation, has got an identifying storyline. So that's the layout. We've got the individual storylines. We've got the tree structure showing how they all fit together. And over on the left-hand side here, we have a summary statement where the results of people's evaluations of the storylines are represented. In this case, it's saying that storyline 71, which we're viewing, was viewed as least desirable by 3 participants, most desirable by none, least likely by 1, and most likely by 1. So there's conflicting views about its likelihood, but everybody, well, there was fairly more agreement on its desirability. Also, I should point out that this interface can be made visible to external observers who are not participants. They can be observing this process while others are contributing to it. In terms of expected outcomes of a PAR-EVO exercise, these will vary per organisation and their particular purposes, whether it's for evaluating what has happened or thinking about what might happen. But there are 3 high-level sort of outcomes which are defined for the use of PAR-EVO. And the first is to develop a diversity of storylines that help us better prepare for the future. And I use the analogy of a fishing net. This diversity of storylines is a bit like a fishing net that we might catch possibilities worth examining, because none of us know exactly what's going to happen in the future. But we can develop various possibilities, and those sets of possibilities may help us think more constructively about what might happen in the future. Well, we'll go into that a bit more as we go on. The second point, which I've almost touched upon there, is in the process of developing this diversity of storylines, we hope to develop people's what is called metacognitive capacity to expand the way we think about the future. If I take the metaphor of a teacher telling a student or helping a student develop an essay plan, they're thinking about how they're going to write the essay. That's a form of metacognition. So here we're trying to develop people's skills about how to think about the future in creative and constructive ways. And the third objective here is, by hosting multiple exercises on this one website, we're accumulating a body of knowledge about how to do these, how to achieve these first 2 objectives. So these are 3 high-level objectives, but as I pointed out, each exercise will have its much more context-specific objectives. I will touch upon now, how are we going for time-wise, Vicky?
You're doing okay, Rick. Probably another 5 minutes.
Okay, so I'm just going to touch upon a little bit on the possibilities of analysis that you can do with the data that's generated from the storylines in a PAR-EVO exercise. And here we can see a scatter plot, and the vertical axis is describing the likelihood of a storyline happening in reality, going from least to the bottom to most at the top. And the horizontal axis is describing the desirability of storylines, going from least at the bottom and at the bottom left and most to the right. And the nodes, or the points in the scatter plot, are the various surviving storylines. And you can see that they range in their likelihood and desirability. So one of the points of plotting, getting people to make these judgments and then looking at their distribution, is firstly to ask what sort of type of storylines are missing. And somewhat surprisingly, if we look in the top right quadrant of most likely and most desirable, there are actually not that many in this space here, which raises questions of, are we, what is behind that? So the first question to ask is, what is missing from our fishing net, our collection of storylines about the possible futures? And then the next question to be asking, and we're doing this in order to try and generate implications for what we should do next, is what sort of storylines are where the judgments are contended. So the red nodes where there was some degree of conflicting judgments. Some people thought storyline 77, a lot of people thought that was most likely and least desirable, but there were some people who had contrary views on this. They thought it was either less likely or more desirable. I can't tell just from the plot by itself. But where there are conflicting judgments on storylines, there isn't some need for discussion and reconciliation of views in that area. Then the other thing that can be done here is there are, once those conflicting views have been reconciled, there is a certain order of precedence, I think, that we can give attention to here. And that is that storylines about events which we think are most likely yet undesirable would arguably deserve some immediate attention. What can we do to avoid that happening, or if it's going to happen, mitigate it? And I suppose climate change is one in that category on a mega scale. Then on the other side, if we could look down the bottom right-hand corner, we've got things which are most desirable but less likely. And these are the storylines where we might be asking, what can we do to enable those things to happen? How can we take those opportunities if they do actually eventuate? And then in the top right corner, we've got things which we think are most likely and desirable. That's where everything is going in the direction, we think everything is going in the direction that we want it to be going. But we can ask the question there about what is the fit between the storylines in that quadrant and our official theories of change. Are they really meshing together, or are we telling a slightly different story here, which might have some implications for updating our theory of change about where we're going? And then using a metaphor of being in the car, and the top right, we're looking forward, and the top left and the bottom right, we're looking out the side windows. And the bottom quadrant, least likely and least desirable, is hopefully something that is out the back window of the car. That there's nothing urgent there at the moment that we need to attend to, but maybe we just need to make sure that our judgments in those areas about those storylines are still appropriate. There are other ways of plotting storylines. So, for example, you could think of getting people to assess storylines in terms of their sustainability, which events are more versus less sustainable and which are more versus less equitable. And you could do some analysis of the storylines there and their implications for action. I'm going to skip over this a little bit, except very quickly to say that there is a search function in the PowerEvo website, and you can put keywords in there and find out where those keywords are occurring, in which iterations, how many contributions have got that keyword, how many storylines, and where they are. And you can also download the results of those keyword searches in a matrix that you can see above. And you can do network visualizations of what ideas that you found through keyword searches are co-occurring in the storylines. But we'll be hearing more about this from others. And finally, not quite finally, but the other way of analyzing the PowerEvo exercise data is to look at the process of participation, how people participated. And in social network analysis, there's a classic distinction between in degree, that is, in this case, where other people added to my contributions, and out degree, where I added to on top of other people's contributions. So in this scatter plot, we've got out degree on the vertical axis and in degree on the horizontal axis, and that gives us various possible combinations of participant behaviors. And I've sort of given these a label. So at the top left corner, where people are not many people are adding to their contributions, but they are adding to other people's contributions. They're people who are largely following other people. They're building on other people's work, but not necessarily getting built upon. The ones in the top right-hand corner are both following other people's work, building on other people's work, but other people are building on their work as well. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, we've got people who are not really building on other people's contributions, but other people are building on them. They're leading. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, we've got people who are largely building on their own ideas, but not anybody else's, and nobody else is building on theirs either. And the interesting question here is, what difference does it make, this pattern of cooperation and working together? What difference does this pattern make to the types of storylines that we're looking at? And this is almost like a research subject that is being pursued by myself at the moment, because my hypothesis basically is that none of these four patterns are ideal by themselves, but what we're looking for is some sort of mix of these behaviors, because even people who are out on their own exploring ideas can sometimes generate ideas which subsequently have big influences on everyone. On the other hand, people who are doing the bridging work, connecting between people's contributions, also have an important role. So I think there's a lot of potential for analyzing how people contribute to views of the future. Last slide, process lessons learned. And I think these lessons will be repeated by others who are presenting. As a facilitator, you quickly learn that you need to follow up, you need to repeat your advice to participants what they have to do next. and you can give your advice through that website itself. You can give it through the emails that you send out to them. But basically, you need to keep encouraging people to be on time with their contributions, sometimes to re-edit them if it's not clear what they're saying, or there are spelling mistakes, or some guidance about appropriate behavior hasn't been closely attended to. The second thing is that the content of the facilitator's guidance is really critical. The facilitator is like a bit like I'm hesitant to say a shepherd, because you don't know where the exercise is going to go, but you don't want to direct people, because that would be pointless. It would be contradicting the whole idea of a participatory exploration. But you've got to be keeping an eye out for what people might be missing, what might be being left out, what is worthwhile highlighting. And this guidance needs to be updated with each new iteration based on your reading of the content that's coming forward. And again, it needs to be sent by multiple channels, by email as well as the website itself. And I suppose the other lesson which I need to be kept reminded of is people do enjoy this exercise. People do enjoy this process. And I think we've got news about that from multiple sources. Vicky, I think that's where I'm at for the time being. There was something else on new developments, but we're going to discuss that later. My apologies for running over time.
Thanks, Rick. I think that's given everyone a really useful overview of not just how it's already being used in a wide range of applications, but also how it differs and how it offers a lot more potential, and that kind of social aspect as well compared to other kind of scenario techniques that are out there. Before we dive into a use case which kind of builds on this, are there any immediate questions for Rick?
Hi, Vicky.
Yes, go ahead, Roma.
Yeah. Hi, Rick. Could you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the relevance of expert and the just plain participatory engagement here?
I think it's largely a matter of horses for courses. It depends on the context in which you're in. But I suppose what I'm emphasizing, it's a bit like evaluative thinking. Everybody does evaluative thinking, but some people have jobs as evaluators. And I think we can go a long way by encouraging evaluative thinking by everyone. So likewise with thinking about the future, I think there are some people who specialize in being futurists, but everybody thinks about the future. And I think one of the ambitions behind this particular process is to try and broaden the range of participants in thinking about the future, but at the same time upgrade their skills and capacities to think about the future in a way that is relevant to their particular situation and context. So it is democratic in sort of ethos, but that does not by definition leave out the role of experts. And I think, in particular, I think there's a role of expert views, which we're doing at the moment with an exercise I think you've already contributed to. With COP25, we've got participants who are just average, not average, but a sample of people in Britain are participating as contributors, but we're engaging other people to post comments on the storylines about whether they think it's realistic or what's missing. And I think that's where people with particular expertise can add real value. They can be questioning the contributions that have been made and getting the participants to think more actively. I suppose the other thing that could be done also is that, following more traditional practice, you could give participants briefings by various experts before the whole exercise started. Likewise, you could engage experts in doing an evaluation of the storylines in parallel with the participants themselves. Right, any other questions?
I don't really have a question, but if I could make a comment on that, I'm Doris from Oxfam International. So we went through a transformative scenario process as part of our global strategy development. And this tool may well have been interesting had we known about it. But just to say that we also questioned a bit the concept of expert, or we really also said the experts are the staff that are working for Oxfam. So the approach we took was similar in some ways to yours. staff across Oxfam developed stories, short stories about the future, and then we brought all of this together in an iterative process. And at the end, 5 global scenarios emerged. So from an Oxfam perspective, I would do it the same way again, in terms of not necessarily having that putting 50 experts in a room and let them figure it out, but really go the participatory way. It was amazing what emerged for us.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah, that struck me actually, as you said that, Rick, from Oxfam's experience. It's a good way to be able to engage what we talk about a lot more about, unusual suspects and people who may not necessarily agree with you with the scenarios that you're developing, to stop groupthink. And then you can invite them into the storyline and they can comment. And that's a way to kind of integrate new perspectives as well than people directly involved in the exercise. I'd like to welcome at this point Louise, an old friend and colleague of mine. So Louise Jackson is director of the newish Digital Societies team at the leading global affairs think tank Overseas Development Institute, or ODI, working on policy and evidence to create successful and equitable digital societies, but also looking at monitoring, evaluation and learning in the digital age. And so Louise will be able to talk us through this kind of futures exercise that they use PariEvo for. So
thanks.
Go ahead, please, Louise.
Thank you very much, Vicky. So I'm delighted to be here because we had a huge amount of fun with the PariEvo. We've actually done 2 PariEvo exercises with Rick. One was to sort of test it out, and then there was one that was I was going to say more serious, but more directed towards the organizational goals. Could you move to the next slide, please, Vicky? Sorry, one after that. And what I want to give you, so Eva is going to talk about the sort of broader shape and scope of a PariEvo exercise, but what I want to give you is the real nuts and bolts of how does it run. And I'm going to end up with, we've got some very detailed analysis of exactly how much time did it take, because I think it's not an exercise that you want to you don't want to, as with any exercise, you don't want to undertake it lightly, even though it's very easy to use. There's a lot of background work that needs to be done, and I think it's important to understand this. But the reason we tried it for fun. So Tina Passon, a colleague of mine who knows Rick well, said, there's this great new tool that Rick has developed. Let's try it. So we did, and we thought it was great. And when COVID hit, I went to our senior leadership team and I said, look, we need to do some scenario work. And there's this tool that could be that can be used in lockdown. We can use it remotely. So let's try it and see. And they were very enthusiastic about it because we were about to go into an organization-wide process of looking at our sort of COVID contingency planning and budgeting. So where do we think the type of work that we are going to be bidding for, because ODI, we have no core funding, we have to cover all of our costs. So to a certain extent, we're trying to be proactive and working with our potential funders to come up with some great ideas that we think they would like, but we're also responding to sort of the standard proposals and tenders that funders put out. So within all of that, we really wanted to understand what the landscape was going to could look like. And what I put on the side is our seed story. I mean, I can't say too much about it because obviously this was a very internal exercise. There were a couple of bits of the seed story that I've had to take out just for confidentiality purposes. But that was basically the idea of what we were trying to look at. And we were very keen. We spent a lot of time working on the seed story because we were very keen that this was not just about the COVID pandemic. We had to think more broadly. So we tried to bring in the Black Lives Matter sort of episode because that was still very current, and it also it's quite important that in terms of the way that ODI works and the implications for the decolonizing development agenda. But the other thing, and I think this speaks to something that Roma was saying, is that there were actually multiple purposes of this exercise. It wasn't just about feeding into the COVID contingency planning. It was also trying to we really didn't want this to be sort of, this is what the senior experts at ODI are saying about the future, and therefore everybody else, including our communications colleagues, our program management colleagues, our global security colleagues. This is therefore what you need to think, because our senior experts have thought that. We really did want it to be a sort of a whole organization effort, if you like, or at least representative of the whole organization. So I think you need to consider, because of the way that PARIVO works, there are other things that you can consider when you're thinking about whether or not you want to use this exercise and how you want to use it. But one of the things we were also interested about was, is it something we could use on a regular basis? Can you go to the next slide, please? So coming back to this idea of, not wanting to be sort of, the senior experts thinking great thoughts and then telling everybody what they thought and writing a report and doing all of that. We canvassed across the organization, and by happy accident, actually, we ended up with 10 participants and with a very even spread of expertise. So we had some people, we had a communications person, we had a couple of program managers, we had some junior researchers, we had some more senior researchers. There was a good gender balance, and we had lots of different nationalities as well. What we did have, we had 2 observers. Mainly they were people, after we had decided on the 10 participants, there were 2 people who said, oh, actually, we'd quite like to join. So we said, well, it's a bit late now, but you can help us with the analysis. So I think that's another point I would like to bring out, is there, there is quite a lot of flexibility in what you can do with people who are interested, but aren't necessarily able to do the writing. And then there was a project management group, and my final slide will show quite how much time that took. But there was a senior member of the senior leadership team, one of our managing directors, and he was kind of the interface, if you like, between what was going on in the exercise and what our chief executive Sarah and the board were asking in terms of COVID contingency planning. So we were trying to making sure that there was that we really understood how the analysis was going to be taken up and used all the way through. And Rick was brilliant, gave us a huge amount of support in and really helped us think through what we were doing. Do you want to go into the next slide? Thanks. So we did have, it was a very tight time frame, because we had to meet a board deadline. That limited us to 8 iterations. We did quite a lot of planning around that, and left a couple of days of sort of wiggle room, because we did think that there were going to be some, we kind of anticipated that there might be a little bit of drop off in enthusiasm. We might need an extra day to say to people, to chivvy them along and to say, yes, you really do need to make your inputs. But it did work out quite well. And with each of the iterations, we talked quite a lot about whether we should just give people free rein, but we ultimately decided that it was going to be easier to have a defined time period for each of the iterations. And we set that at 3 months to begin with, although as we got further out, we extended that to 6 months. And then as standard, we had the evaluation phase and the final workshop. The point Rick was making about the guidance is really important. And my natural inclination, because I was the person writing the guidance, my natural inclination is to really be quite directive and say to people, come on, you need to think more broadly, and why not situate a story in another country? Why not, take the point of view of this sort of person? Why is nobody talking about the private sector in all of this? Rick's job was to say, no, you can't say that. So we really had to think very carefully about how to try and encourage people to think more broadly without telling them how to think more broadly. And I think we succeeded to a certain extent. I think if we now took that same group of people and ran the same exercise, they would understand a lot more. It did take, I would say it took about 3 or 4 iterations before I felt that people really got the sort of the inherent freedom in the exercise. At the beginning, the storylines were sort of felt a little bit constrained. Although some of them went a bit mad, and one of them we had to ask to rewrite because it had really sort of flown off the handle. But they were, it takes a bit of time, and this may be characteristic of ODI. We're researchers. We like our evidence. But on the other hand, we had program managers and communications people as well who, were not so wedded to that sort of research style of writing. So, but understanding how to write the guidance is really, really important, and giving that sort of freedom within a framework, if you like. But the other thing that was also important was just keeping up with the writing team and letting them, bringing them together to reflect with us, talking about, some of the things that were happening, talking about timelines. People suddenly saying, actually, we've got a whole bunch of deadlines on Wednesday. Can we shift it to Thursday? And just doing that sort of basic management, getting people not to worry so much about writing styles. Being careful not to let people get too humorous. The temptation is for people to start to joke around with this a lot, but it's actually very difficult to add to a story if somebody has already, somebody's put a lot of humor into it. So we had to, we had to manage that with the group. And so what this is all building up to is this is actually quite a sort of it's quite a process. It's quite a process, and the role of the project management group is very important. There is a lot of chasing of people, that setting deadlines and then sending them an email the night before, and then sending them another email on the morning, and then saying, actually, okay, you can have an extra 3 hours because you've come to me, and asked for an extension. So you really do have to be on top of it. This is not something that you can sort of run and then people will self-organize. Next slide. What the observers did, which was very helpful. So there was this project management group of 3, and we ran the process. But we asked the observers to do some analysis, to read through the stories. So we were able to read through the stories as well. But they brought a different viewpoint. We thought about doing some sentiment analysis. There are various programs online where you can put in text and it'll look at the sentiment. But actually, we decided that this was something that the observers could do, come through, reading the stories and just giving us their thoughts on what were the emotions that were coming out, because we knew that we were facing a very difficult time. So it was going to be a difficult topic environment, given that ODI, we've got a very broad swathe of issues that we work on. So which issues did we think might be downplayed in the COVID recovery, and which issues did we think might be highlighted by the people that we work with, and so we really wanted to understand how the organisation was likely to feel about all of this. And it was an interesting mix. It was not all bad. I mean, some of the moods were assessed as positive and new horizons and confidence and things. And this fed into the guidance process. This understanding sort of fed into the process of writing the guidance. And then towards the end, we had the regular evaluation phase that Rick highlighted in his slides, and then we had a workshop to discuss that and to discuss the inductive analysis. Do you want to go to the next slide, Vicky? So this was just one of the very simple sort of this is just an Excel spreadsheet that we used to capture the themes that were emerging. So this was a very simple, we just inductively analysed the stories and highlighted where what themes were emerging. And this was where we were able to think, well, how do we encourage people to think about how COVID might intersect with some social unrest in the rest of the world that's happening for another reason, or how might it intersect with sort of climate, or how might it intersect with something else. And one of the things that did come out quite strongly was we were constantly surprised that nobody was really talking about private sector engagement, which was just a thing that we were interested in and took into the final workshop and discussed that. And then on the right hand side, this was so each of the columns in that green space were just the moods that both of our observers picked up on. Do you want to go to the next slide? But the point of that previous slide was just to say, you can do some very simple analysis. That would be very helpful.
What did you do? No, I promise. This is so bad.
Sorry, hello?
Okay, Share responsibilities.
Share responsibilities. Oh my goodness, yes, yes. So this is a shot of what our story tree looked like, and we came up with we selected three sort of, I don't want to call them archetypal stories because archetype isn't quite the right word, and it has sort of particular connotations. But we did identify sort of three really, sort of good stories. The more likely and the less more likely less desirable, and the less likely more desirable, and then a third story, and those came out of the workshop where we said to people, if there were three stories that you would like to sort of take forward to highlight what we've been doing, which ones would those be? But what was most important, I think, rather than getting hung up on identifying those stories and working into them and were they likely to be correct or whatever, was this big question that came through very strongly in all the stories, was constantly questioning how, given COVID and given the fact that ODI as an organisation does not have core funding, we are responsive to what our donors and our funders want us to do, is how can we be an agent rather than a victim of change? And that came through very strongly in the storylines, not as a map of how to do it, but as a question. And so this was certainly a question that we fed into all the rest of our strategic planning. And I think if there was only one thing that came out of our Parivo exercise and that was it, it kind of seems obvious when you think about it, but obviously there was a huge amount behind it, but it is a powerful question. Could you go to the next slide, please? So there were a couple of other interesting things, and I think it is important to do the evaluation afterwards. So even though we were very careful to try and not have this being sort of the experts talking to the rest of ODI, it was the senior people whose stories were most added to. We don't quite know why. It's just a thing. We don't know whether we haven't repeated the exercise again. We would love to, but haven't had the time or the headspace to do it. But the other thing that did come through was the evaluation workshop. People in the evaluation workshop were quite worried at the the sort of the dev speak that was coming through, and had we really been looking out for our blind spots? Had we really been examining our biases? And was there something that we as the facilitators could have done to try and encourage slightly more expansive thinking? So there was some sort of interesting ideas, but I think our evaluation workshop at the end, people generally agreed that maybe as a group we were still a little bit stuck in a rut. And there wasn't any of the sort of really sort of breakout thinking that could have really challenged what we do. So again, nothing wrong with that. It's just it's something to reflect on. So these 2 points, how can ODI be an agent rather than a victim of change, and are we still stuck in a rut in terms of our thinking? Big questions that we could take forward. So my final slide, I think I'm okay for time, Vicky. I'll take 1 minute. It's just to show you, we got people to record their time on timesheets, so we've got a very detailed analysis of what it cost. It's 20 hours each over the 8 iterations. People took, and maybe because we're ODI researchers, people took a lot longer than 30 minutes to read the stories and write write, to read what had been written before and then write their own story. And of course, the longer you go, by iteration 8, you're already reading 8 contributions before you add your own. We would reckon on 20 hours over the 8 iterations, and about double that for the facilitators to do the chivying, to write the guidance, to do all of that. And the main thing is how useful it was and how much it was appreciated by the senior team and by our board, because we were able to then say to the directors of the organisation, you've got to go into the COVID planning. We want you to use all of this information, read through the stories. They're not predictions, but they're going to spark ideas for you so that you can do your contingency planning in a frame of mind that is maybe a bit broader than you might otherwise have done. So it was a hugely useful process. People really enjoyed doing it. A little bit stuck at the beginning, but after, as I said, after about 3 or 4 iterations, people were did very much enjoy doing it. And a couple of people said it was the most enjoyable thing they'd done all year, which was great. So I think I'll leave it there and see if anybody's got any questions.
Thanks, Louise. So intensive but worthwhile, fun during tough times, but also what I think is a really nice link between kind of operational planning and kind of longer term strategic thinking, and quite a nice way to marry the two. So we do have time for a couple of any comments or questions for Louise before we take a quick break.
I don't have a question, but I can confirm. I mean, we didn't use this tool, but it can really be fun. And for us, I mean, we did it before COVID, but still, you know, in a period where Oxfam was recovering from all sorts of other things, and it can be so important also just to reorient the thinking to the world and to the impact that we can have, and to lift people out a bit of this being obsessed with too much internal stuff. And I think one opportunities in the tool that I see, I mean, I understand it's anonymous and you know, but attributable, but also that just building connections between people in different parts of the organization can be incredibly motivating and inspiring for them. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, it's great. Thanks, Doris.
I think that's a really important point, and also building connections between sort of junior people and senior people. So it's not, you know, it's different levels as well as different types of expertise. That was very important for us. So in response to Julia's question, have we done the process once or twice? We did we trialed it once and then used it twice, and then used it once, if you see what I mean. What we learned from the trial was the importance of getting the seed story right, because the trial, I think, Rick, if you remember, we had quite an open seed story and it kind of went all over the place, and we couldn't really what did we learn from the seed story? That the seed story needs to be sort of slightly tighter, but mostly it was really, you need to be clear about the purpose. You know, why are you doing this? And for us, you know, anchoring it around the COVID contingency planning was really important. Not that we wanted that to sort of shape the. It was important for us as the project management group. It wasn't important for the writers. The writers needed to be so kind of given free rein. But the project management group, we needed to be quite clear what the purpose was, so that we could work back from that and select a seed story that kept things a little bit more focused than what we had done in the trial. But we would certainly use it again. We just need to think carefully about the time commitment. The purpose must be as specific as possible. I don't know, Rick, what would you say to that? How do you balance sort of breadth of purpose with specificity?
Yeah, that's a piece of string question, I think. I wouldn't go so far as to say the purpose must be as specific as possible. It should be as clear as possible.
Yeah.
But not necessarily hyper specific.
Yes, clear. I think, yeah, or maybe for us it was kind of the use case. It was, what is this being used for?
Nick, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks for the presentations. Those were great. And I guess question for either of the presenters. With my experience of the kind of 2x2 scenario planning exercise, communication of the scenarios is really important. So having someone to kind of encapsulate what the scenario is all about, you know, as a story, but sometimes with pictures or slogans, can really help people engage with the scenario. So I was just wondering with PAR-EVO how that whole thing works. So clearly you get quite a detailed and rich story, but I'm just curious, do you find it difficult to get people who, at the end of the process, when you're looking at taking a look back at the scenarios, do you find it hard to get people to actually, you know, focus on the story, read the story? Because it seems, you know, on screen slightly text heavy, and I know that sometimes that can be a bit of a turn off for people who don't have much of an attention span. So how do you know, how can PAR-EVO help those without long attention spans, or those that need, you know, maybe a visual way of communicating a story to get their head around what the story's about?
I think if I can just respond to that, Nama might contribute something about this when she comes to her presentation, because she was working in a very different context to what we've described so far. One thing that Louise has done with her exercise was to give headlines to, or names to, the storylines. And you saw a slide there and I thought that was a really useful exercise. And my plan is to build that into any evaluation of the exercises from now on. We'll ask the participants to give a name to one or more of the storylines that they felt they had a good idea for a name for, because I think that both gives a handle to the storyline, but it also captures some idea of the sentiment or meaning behind the storyline. The other thing that we do in the evaluation questions is we ask people to do, in a sense, what's an online pile sorting exercise. And you ask people, can you sort these storylines into two groups and tell me the difference between those two groups? So some people might say, well, these ones here are very internationalist in their perspective, whereas these ones here, they're all stuck in just this really one location. This story over here, they're all about ODI as the hero and saving the world. And over here, it's ODI is sort of only a minor part of the picture. So pile sorting enables you to identify broad, significant differences between the storylines. So I think those two ideas have got some mileage, but I think your comment about the limitations of text still stands. And this does raise the question of, is there other ways of bringing in other media into this sort of exercise? But also, I think in face-to-face situations, which Nama will be talking about, there's probably a lot more opportunities there. I'll let other people comment accordingly.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, we're a research organisation, we're a think tank, so we're used to operating in a pretty text-heavy environment. So that wasn't so much of a concern for us, but I can see. I mean, the stories are limited to, is it 150 words, Rick? And I mean, you can make them shorter if you want to. So it's not a huge amount of text that you're not reading pages and pages and pages. So it's not difficult to read what you need to read. It takes time, and if you're going to be, if you've got 10 people, you've got to read 10 sets of 8 iterations. So that does take time. Terry's point on the use case, how do we utilize the scenarios in practice? We encourage people to go and read the scenarios if we had time, but we pulled out some of the main points that came out of the evaluation workshop. So the evaluation workshop was super important in highlighting what the writers how the writers looked back on the exercise and what they thought the main issues were. And those we then fed into a paper that went out to all the directors of programs to say, now you're doing your contingency planning, consider some of these things that could happen, and and if these happened, what from that would you take into how you're planning the type of work that you want to do, how you're planning your the shape of your team, how you're planning all of these sorts of things. So it was very closely linked to the business planning that we all had to go through. And were there surprises in their usability? We did utilize them as planned. No, I don't think there were any surprises. I don't remember any surprises, Rick. It was all. It was partly because we managed it quite carefully, and were very prepared and told all the directors, you need to be open-minded when you read through these stories. The point is not to say, well, I agree with this one and disagree with that one, but to think, oh, actually, that's quite an interesting point. Maybe in terms of my team and my planning, I need to consider that might happen. And if that happened, then okay, so I'll take that into my contingency thinking.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for your exchange and answers. And we'll have a bit more time at the end, but I think we'll do a quick 5-minute brain break before we start talking about the PAR. Great. So welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good break. At this point, I'd like to invite Eva, who's an independent consultant with significant experience in international development, working with both NGOs and multilaterals, who has recently been part of a team from IOD Park carrying out an independent evaluation of UN volunteers. And Eva is going to tell us about how Parivo featured within that. And it's going to be as a story. So go ahead, Eva.
Hi, hello everybody. Yeah, so I am part of a team of 4 people who are undertaking an evaluation for UN volunteers. We are now at the late stages of the evaluation, so it's still not published, it's still not final. So for those of you who don't know who UN volunteers are, I think most of you would know actually that it is United Nations program administered by UNDP, and they basically do 2 things. One is they promote voluntarism, but also they recruit and deploy people as UN volunteers, mainly in UN entities around the world, right? So this is what they do. So they employed a consultancy firm based in Britain, IOD Park, of which I am part of, the team I am part of. We were a team of 4. One of my colleagues is also here. It's Cia Gomez Carrasco. She's also here in the workshop. So she'll be able to talk as well if you've got questions for us. And we were supported by Rick, which name I have underlined because he was absolutely wonderful. So thank you very much. I'm making a point of trying to thank him publicly as in any opportunity I have. So thank you again, Rick, for the wonderful support. In the evaluation of UN volunteers, what happened was that we had a very big constituency of UN volunteers actually themselves, and we wanted to involve them in the evaluation in a way that it was meaningful. So just for you to have an idea, UN volunteers in 2020, they mobilized more than 9,000 people to be UN volunteers around different UN entities around the world. And when we were planning the data generation phase late last year and the beginning of this year, they had more than 5,700 serving UN volunteers around. So we wanted to involve them in a way that it was meaningful, as I said, and it was somehow complementary of the type of surveys that we evaluators normally use. And this is where we sort of Parivo, and Parivo kind of came to a rescue in the shape of just an email in one of these groups that we belong to, evaluators in the Peregrine group. So we saw it and we thought, well, this is probably a helpful way to involve this constituency. But we actually been using Parivo just as a pilot. So because we were not very sure about what to expect. What we have done is use the information that we got from Parivo just as to confirm findings that we were shaping based on other data collection sources as well. So that in that way was that complementary to the survey that we sent to all the serving UN volunteers. When we were working on our inquiry matrix, the evaluation matrix, almost by intuition, we thought that what is the kind of information that we would expect from this tool. Some of the very traditional evaluation questions, if you're familiar with the DAC criteria, for example, the relevance questions, whether what UN volunteers is doing in their strategic framework, which was what we are evaluating concretely, is relevant to different types of stakeholders, and particularly to the UN volunteers. Or we had another sub-questions where we were exploring how UN volunteer actually position itself vis-a-vis other volunteer involved in organizations. So why people would go for UNV rather than other form of volunteering. And so we actually put the name Parivo in our evaluation matrix and the data collection tools against some of these evaluation questions, although we were not very sure exactly what to expect, as I say. So we're just like piloting. We reach out to Rick, And he gave us like wonderful advice. And from there, we started shaping the exercise. So the first thing that we did was to select our teams of writers among those huge constituency of volunteers. It was very helpful that UNV has a volunteer reporting application. So, and in that volunteer reporting application, they had the option to write open-ended comments in some places. So the first thing that we did was selecting the people who were contributing more eagerly in that volunteer reporting application, and also people who had good English, because we could do the pilot only in English. So we got all of that population, and then we cross-reference that with other variables, other criteria, trying to make sure that it was a group that is gender balanced and geographically balanced, and people also who were national volunteers, so they were volunteering in their own country, and people who were international volunteers working in development context or in humanitarian or peace context. So we selected that pool, and then we invited them all to see who wanted to be part of our exercise. And the first people who replied willingly, then we selected them, and actually we got a very good mixed and very diverse group of people who were going to help us with this exercise. We also had observers, and possibly one of the things that I would do differently the next time is give the observer a role, a bigger role that they had. But at this in this exercise, the observers were some people within the commissioner of, so some people in UN volunteers themselves, and I can see that Sandra is also here with us. So hello, Sandra. And but just a group of them in UN volunteers headquarters. So there was observing how the exercise was coming along. We invited them after the third or fourth iteration. We organized the exercise in 8 different iterations, like the previous one that was presented by Luis. And each iteration was kind of chronologically thematic, I would say. So in the first one, we were asking UN volunteers to talk about the motivation, what brought them to UNV. The second part about the recruitment process. The third part about how they felt, the sentiments, and what was happening when they arrived to their placement, so like the first week or so. The fourth and fifth iteration was about the first half of their placement, and the sixth and seventh about the second half, and then the last iteration was about life after UN volunteers, right? After they have been a volunteer. So we asked them to write a fiction. This was the beginning of our seed story. So in our seed story, there was a volunteer called Ari, who could be a man or a woman from the south or from the north, or in different development or humanitarian settings. And we were asking the writers, who were a team of 16 people, we were asking them to write in first person as if they were Ari. So based on their own experiences or of experiences of other UN volunteers they have met. And so in this case, we didn't have the problem of who was the expert or not, because obviously they were all experts. They was talking, the whole idea was about unpacking the experience of what it is like to be a UN volunteer. So they were all experts in that regard, because they all were UN volunteers. And this is how we wanted to build all the different storylines. You are already familiar with how Paribo looks like, so that is how our our Parivo webpage looks like. UN Volunteers has been kind enough to give us permission to make public this exercise, so that you can go and have a look at it if you're interested in. We ended up with 10 complete stories, although we had 16 participants, because not in all the iterations all the people were participating. So we ended up with 10 complete story at the end of the exercise. And I'm just going to tell you also how we use the data, the information that we got. There was 3 types of analysis that we have done. One was to analyze the most likely story, and I'm going to tell you how that happened. Then also analyzing just general things that were emerging from the entire set of all the different stories that we've put together collectively. And another way of analyzing it was linking different iterations with particular evaluation questions as well. So the first one was about the most likely story. So as Rick have said, at the end of this exercise, we also wanted to validate it with a wider audience. And in this case, we validated it with the entire audience of UN volunteers serving. So we sent a survey to all the 5,700 and something UN volunteers, sending them the complete set of storylines and asking them several questions. 2 of them were particularly important for us. So the first one was if these stories were realistic, if they could actually relate to it. And it was fantastic to see that the majority of the people said that it was realistic, that all the stories that they read was realistic. We also asked them in an open question, what are the elements that are missing from these stories, the things that you were surprised not to find, and that was also gave us important information for some of the evaluation questions. And then, but the other one that was very important was ask them what was the most likely story, so the one that resonates more with UN volunteers' experience in abstract. And so we had that our storyline 71 as the most likely that people voted on. We've actually got quite a few replies, around a little bit less than 700. We were very worried though that all the stories were in English, and while the general survey, we send it in 3 languages, this exercise, this other survey, we were really aware that only people who could read English could understand the stories and participate in this. But this is why we were piloting, and we looked at what is different in this storyline 71 to the rest of the storylines, and also what are the elements that are included in this storyline that resonate with the findings, that can either confirm the findings or are opposite to the findings that were shaping in the exercise. And well, we had several findings in that. This is just one example how one of the findings was that UNV is tremendously effective on the recruitment side. They are super quick, flexible, effective so far, and that was, for example, one of the aspects that were in that story 71. Another way of looking at it was looking at the entire data set of all the stories, and with there as well, we were able to confirm some of the information. For example, we did an analysis of word frequency in the entire data set, and we saw that UNV is far more present in the life of UN volunteers at the recruitment stage and the onboarding stage, and then the host agencies start getting more of the centrist page rather than that UNV. So this is kind of finding that we were able to confirm. We also did a type of analysis that were just like against each of the interactions. So a kind of horizontal analysis. For example, there were that question about what was UNV unique offering to people, and we got all the information from the first iteration, where we were asking people what motivated them to be a UN volunteer. So we could analyze the entire data set, but just in that one iteration. So we kind of saw the themes that were emerging from it, that were also very in line with the findings that we got from other data sources. So what we saw basically then is that Parivo is a very rigorous method, right? It definitely was very aligned with the findings that we were getting through more traditional ways of generating information. So it is rigorous and also is more meaningful. We felt it was particularly useful when we were talking about sensitive issues, precisely because the people are because the contributions are anonymous, but can be done in a qualitative way. So it was particularly useful for that, and we ended up having testimonies and stories and contributions that were actually quite they were very powerful and honest and sensitive and raw as well, and so that was very, very interesting. I think we've also learned, because we didn't know what to expect, that what is the optimum size, around 12, 15 participants max, because as I think as Luis has said yesterday before, it requires a lot of time to support the exercise and to do the follow-up and so on. For the type of exercise that we were doing, like less than 72 hours per iteration, less than 3 days, is just simply not viable. So you have to allow a longer span of time that we previously thought of. So the Parivo ran through a little bit longer than we expected. When we got the stories from Parivo, we were already doing preliminary findings, or this is something that we need to tally a little bit better. And also something that we learned is that it is very good Parivo if you complemented it with another type of qualitative software, like NVivo, for example, where you can do a little bit more sophisticated, like mining data or content analysis or so on. There are many things that I am going to do differently next time, which is going to be definitely will be a next time, because it has been super useful. I think it would have been more useful if we would have had a better alignment between the iterations and the evaluation questions. And also I think probably I would want to do a initial workshop with all the writers. I think that's probably the top two tips. And I think this is I'm running a bit 2 minutes. Okay, so right, so I think this is it. Next time that I'm going to be using Parivo is going to be in another evaluation that I'm conducting at the moment with another colleague of mine who is also in this workshop with Cristina. We are doing an evaluation on gender mainstreaming for UNODC, and we are planning to use Parivo there as well. So any suggestions that you have in that regard will be very welcome as well, and I'm also here to answer any question as best as I can. I think that's very much it. That's a helpful contribution from Parivo as well, the story 74, in the last iteration. That I thought it was particularly apt to close this presentation, and I think that's all from me.
Thanks, Eva. So we have 20 minutes, and we've also got another contributor, Nama, who we'd like to hear from as well, just to add another flavour on how Parivo has been used. But if there are any quick questions or comments for Eva, please could you kind of pop them in the chat or come on camera, or again raise your hand. Okay, there is a question from Terry. Eva, I don't know if you can see that. Was it mixed stories or did everyone build their own?
Yeah, well, that was mixed. I think there was a couple of people that were building their own stories, and they were very adamant about this, actually. But most of them were just like following other people's stories. Like all the contributions were based in their experience. Like they weren't literal, all of them. Some of them were, but some of them were a little bit of a fictional, or yeah.
If I can just make a comment there, my experience so far is that the proportion of people who just build on their storylines, there is often one or two people who do that, but they tend to be in the minority. And I don't see that as a problem so far.
And Christina, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I have a question for Rick, actually, related to the presentation by Eva. I mean, the way Eva and her team have used Parivo, or the way it might be used in an evaluation process or context, questions some of the characteristics of Parivo that you mentioned, you know, the forward-looking aspect, for example, that future scenario. Here we are looking to the past, and also the imaginative aspect. For example, Eva and her team, they were researching on assessing on personal stories based in evidence. Yeah. How do you feel about this approach, and how? I mean,
I feel quite, as someone said recently, I feel intensely relaxed about this. Because the reconstruction of history, as you're probably aware, is often involves a lot of imagination and diverse sources of information, and sometimes conflicting sources of information. So history is not an objective, written in stone, a universally acknowledged series of events. There's a lot of human interpretation and recollection and meaning making involved in the reconstruction of histories. And I think I'm not a total relativist, but I think, you know, taking a sort of social constructionist view on history has its place. So I think it is important that we try and understand how people are reviewing their life experiences, and you know, balance that both with some sympathy for the actor themselves, but also some attention to knowledge, you know, what we know about the wider environment in which they were living and working. That sounds like a very long response, but I basically I'm quite okay with it, and I think I look forward to seeing more explorations of reconstructions of histories of the kind that Eva and perhaps yourselves might be involved in.
Thanks. And Lauriane, I think Naama will be able to answer your question. So I'd like to invite Naama at this point. So Naama is the Agribusiness, Environment and Climate Advisor from Global Insight, and has been using Parivo in quite a different way in a kind of project level and in face-to-face settings. And I think you can also probably talk about this, how you use it where participants may not have the highest level of education. So Naama, welcome. Please, could you tell us some of your overall experiences, how you used it, and what are some of the similarities or shared experiences from your kind of lessons based on what we've heard already? Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. So hello, everyone, and I'm really happy to participate even for a short while in this workshop, because I truly value this methodology, and I think it has a lot of potential and it's really useful. So I've been using it in an evaluation process of a large seed sector development in Uganda, actually, which had a lot of components, both with research organization, private sector, governmental sector, looking at seed policy. But also what they did is they worked with smallholder farmers on developing local seed businesses. So they taught and enhanced the ability of smallholder farmers to grow seed as a business. And we wanted to use Parivo to evaluate that specific section of the whole program, because what we wanted to do is we wanted to encourage these groups to develop their own stories of change. And we wanted to see how the local businesses members generate data on, you know, what value the project has created to them, both personally and collectively. And Parivo is a great fit for this. So what we did is, in similar to Eva, we did a backward-looking evaluation process, but in difference to both Louise and Eva, this was face-to-face. So unfortunately, by the way, I have to say, I wasn't able to travel because of COVID. I did all the planning, all the writing, definition, development of the methodology, but I was not able to facilitate. And of course, I did all the analysis. So overall, we had 12 workshops with 10 participants. So there were 120 participants in this methodology. So it provided a really, really rich substrate to analyze the process. We had 8 backward-looking scenarios, starting with a seed, and then we had 2 forward-looking scenarios. So we asked participants to kind of visualize where they'll be in 1 year from now and in 5 years from now. And this was extremely important because it provided information on how, first of all, where would they like to see themselves, but also what they think about the sustainability of the project impacts. So some of the things that were really successful is that, first of all, very similar to Louise and Eva, people really liked it. So they appreciated the methodology, they found it useful. They said some interesting things. They said, for example, it provided everyone with an opportunity to contribute. A lot of time in focus group discussions, there's somebody who overtakes everything and somebody who doesn't participate at all. And here, everyone counted, everyone was equal. Because it was anonymous. One participant said that it helped them realize that they all think alike, right? And they have a common understanding following the same lines. They also said that through this activity, they learned to value opinions coming from others and to better appreciate that there's other members that share their values and the processes, and they all contribute to the group development. As an evaluator, it was really important for me to understand the reasons why some groups were successful and some groups were not. Understand what type of support each type of group needs, and of course, learning about the sustainability. Some less successful experience that I want to share is similar to Louise and Eva. We saw that it was difficult. So it needed a lot of explanation, and the first 1 or 2 or even 3 iterations were kind of trying it out, but by the 3rd and 4th iteration, people were really clear and things that were developed really, really quickly. The whole process was very long. The workshop took between 4 and 5 hours. Because also we had, in addition to the iteration, which was most of it, we also did an evaluation section, and we also asked them to evaluate the methodology itself, which ended up being really, really interesting. So another less successful component was the evaluation. So because they developed these storylines together, evaluating the storylines turned out to be providing less information, because what they said is that the storylines were really similar. They were all true. They were all representing what really happened. So the evaluation of the storylines by participant didn't provide a lot of value. For me as an evaluator, evaluating the storylines provided a lot of value. I want to just add a few more points. So similar to Louise and Eva, Rick support and guidance was essential. And thank you, Rick, for helping me through this. I think that as an evaluator, it took us even more time, because what they did, and I'm sorry I can't share this with you, there's not time to do that, but if you could see a photo of it, they used sticky notes on a board, And so each participant wrote their short storyline on a sticky note, and then they pinned it on a board. And so afterward, we had to transcribe all of these notes into computer, and then analyze that. And we did use Atlas TI, by the way, to analyze the storylines, which turned out to be very helpful. Nick asked about engagement of people, and that's a really, really important point. We had very few cases where people lost interest. They were mostly elder people. I think only in 2 cases people kind of sat in the back and decided not to participate, but mostly people were extremely engaged. There is one caveat, and the caveat is that illiterate people had more difficulties, of course, with this methodology, because they had to read other participants' input and they had to write their own. We had people that helped the facilitators, and especially positioned in order to help people that cannot read and write. But one of the things we acknowledge only after we analyzed all the data is that most of the illiterate were women. And it's kind of it's a problem, especially when you want to have gender representation, equal representation in this exercise. So I'll be happy to share more, but I know that the time is limited.
Yeah, thanks, Naama. We can probably carry on after for anyone who's interested in speaking to any of the kind of panel. Are there any kind of last questions? Please join us in the Slido again. Would like to see kind of your thoughts on whether you feel no more about scenario planning and Parivo itself, hopefully, having heard about it for 2 hours. And also whether you feel that you have an idea about where you might use it yourself. If you have any ideas, please do pop them in the chat. While we see for that, Louise, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to it's a general comment, and it kind of goes back a little bit, so it's not specifically on Eva's presentation or on Naama's presentation. But for anybody who is familiar with the sort of the standard 2x2 scenario planning, so I started my I did some sort of horizon scanning and future stuff in the early days of horizon scanning and futures, and I actually got very disillusioned with the 2x2 scenario planning, because I felt they were all the same. There was there was the positive, negative, 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 positive, negative, and negative, positive scenarios, because you couldn't help but sort of there was a sort of a group think and a group bias that came into the way that the axes were all developed, and then you just sit and you just have fun, mainly coming up with a zippy name for each of the scenarios and then building the scenario around the name. And I think what is really important about Parivo is it takes away the opportunity for doing that, and the anonymity of each of the anonymity of the contributions is really important. So while groupthink is fun, and there is something to be said for sort of sparking off each other, the 2x2 scenario, and I know there are many other approaches, but the 2x2 is a sort of a fairly standard one, and I do think there's more unexpected richness when you use Parivo, and so I just wanted to throw that in. It was a comment that I failed to make earlier.
Thank you. Christina, did you still have your hand up again, or was that just from earlier? I just wanted to make sure that I've captured you if it was a new hand. No. Okay, that's great. So, Rick, are you either on this point or what's next and the new evolutions that you're seeing as well? And you're mute.
I'd just like to say something about Naama's experiment. I thought it was really impressive. The scale on which you tried to do it, the fact that you're doing it at a distance, the fact that you're involving illiterate people, some illiterate people, I think it was a really ambitious piece of work and really impressive in the fact that you took it forward.
Thank you. And I just want to add the end point of this evaluation is we mapped. So the when you do the online, when you use the online tool, as you go, you develop this graphing of the different segments, the different nods and storylines, and we had to do that after the process. But it really did create an understanding of the story of each of these groups, and it really provided a lot of information and deep understanding on the efficiency and the effectiveness of the method of the project. So it was worth it.
Great. So we are going to just project the results of the Slido. Rick, if you could tell us kind of interesting new developments, and then we will just throw up some last information on where people can find out more about both PAREVO and scanning, but we'll also make sure that you get that by email as well. Great. So Rick, go ahead. We're definitely seeing a movement more from the 2s and 3s into the 3s and 4s, I think, on these questions, which is a good sign. Yeah, so what's definitely more on how we now know about PAREVO, which is great. So we've kind of met some of the objectives that we set out for this session. And great, good number of people interested in using it as well. So kind of committed to the time that might be involved, but have seen the value in what it can deliver and the breadth of its applications. So yeah, Rick, can you tell us what else you're seeing? What else is coming new? And at the same time, I'll just put up a slide where people can see whether they can get more information on PAREVO as well. Thank you very much.
So one thing that I'll be giving more attention to is how can we widen the choice of roles for people when participating in a PAREVO exercise. And originally it was just participants would contribute storylines and they might contribute comments on those storylines. But more recently now we're thinking, and I think Eva and Nama and Louise have all sort of explored this as well. We've got the idea of observers who can be inputting into the facilitators' thinking, backing them up. We've got observers who can be commenting, and that's what's happening with one of the exercises at the moment. We've got other parties we could have multiple different parties participating as evaluators. So at the moment, we've got the role of contributor, commentator, evaluator, and observer. And I think that gives the process just a lot more flexibility in terms of the breadth of people and the number of people that we can get engaged in a PAREVO exercise. The actual number of people who can participate, I think the maximum so far is 15 as direct contributors. And I've got a feeling this might be as many as the maximum that might be desired. This is something to be explored. But as I said, being a direct contributor is only one of the roles, and you can have any number of people commenting. And with Eva's example of a follow-up survey where she had 600 or 700 people, commenting effectively through the survey. I've also looked at the possibility of teams as participants. So each team would have one person who represented their views in a collective PAREVO exercise. In a sense, we almost went down that route with ODI, but not quite. Another possibility is of an online participation whereby you have a first come, first serve basis. You might have 50 people who are interested in participating, but the first people to make their contributions up to the maximum of 15 get accepted. Just some imagination, I think, we need about how to vary the number of participants. The other thing that I'm interested in is this exploration of alternative histories. I think that's underway at the moment. And I'm also interested in how we can do more face-to-face versions of the kind that Nama has described. On the technical front, I think the search function has got a lot of potential use coming along, and there's various other small changes to the software that are underway at the moment.
Thanks, Nama. I think you wanted to say something as well.
Yes, one more thing that I forgot to mention, and I would like to see more work around that is, and Luis mentioned that as well, is better understanding how we direct people or provide prompts on what we want them to reflect on, because it's such a wide opportunity to tell your story, but you want people to be more specific. So I think that that's another thing to consider working more robustly in the future. Thank you.
One other thing, I think the mention was made of the usefulness of a preparatory workshop in advance. Was that Eva that made that comment, or yourself, Nama? I think that idea has got a lot of mileage as well. It might mean the learning how to do it phase of the exercise goes a lot quicker.
Great. So just to wrap up, we'll make sure all the participants get this, but the kind of support that's available, Rick, and the kind of community of practice that's around PAREVO.
Basically, we've got two websites and an email list. The web app itself is just parevo.org, but in terms of full information about how the web app works and all the possibilities, it's the second one there. That title, MSc Innovations, is just an old website which I co-opted for this purpose, so it's a little bit misleading to have the word MSc in there. But it is a sibling of Most Significant Change, believe it or not. It has its origins in the same PhD research. And then we have the email list, which is of all people who have expressed interest in using and talking about the PAREVO app, and you're all welcome to join that.
And I've seen how responsive you are, Rick, in terms of that and giving people ideas and responses to questions. So you're close to seeing what's going on. And I'm sure you welcome people getting in touch if they're interested in using it. The same with the scanning community. Thank you so much to everyone who's participated. Just a couple final things to how to keep in touch. You can get in touch with me at my email, vtung@icscentre.org. You can subscribe to our monthly Futures newsletter. We have Futures content on our podcasts, Civil Society Futures and Innovation, which you can access on all mainstream podcast platforms. We have some upcoming events we'll be running another version of our Feminist Futures After COVID-19 workshop on the 17th of May for Scanning the Horizon community members. We'll have a launch event for a new guide to foresight in the social change field by our friends and partners at Just Labs. You can check out our past content on YouTube, and there's more about the Scanning the Horizon community on our website or through me. But thank you so much for everyone who presented and everyone who was interested in finding out more about PAREVO, and we're excited to be part of the journey to see how this whole use of this very exciting tool develops. So thanks very much.